Okay, so for this Edpuzzle, we're going to be looking at communication and perception, specifically through the medium of sound and acoustic communication. Communication, of course, what we've been talking about, which is the sending and receiving of information. That information is contained in signals. Signals are specifically designed so that they change, on average, change the receiver's behavior in a way that it benefits the sender. And so the sending and receiving of information, of course, is communication. So sound is propagated through a medium, much like light, although light flows like a transverse wave, as we can see in the image here at the bottom. And along that wave are traveling little packets of energy called photons. With a sound wave, though, the energy is contained in the vibration of molecules of the medium, either, again, air, water, or ground in some cases. The molecules are bumping into each other, and of course, every time they bump into each other, they lose a little bit of energy to the environment, and they pass on some of their energy to the next particle. So what we're seeing essentially is a sound wave propagates as a longitudinal wave, essentially a compression wave, where you have these areas that are known as zones of compression. Those are the peaks of the wave, where all of the molecules are bunched up together. And then you have zones of rarefaction, which are the troughs of the wave. And those are the areas where the molecules are spread further apart from each other. And so basically our molecules are squishing together and then spreading out as the wave energy is transmitted through the medium away from the source. And most of the sources that we're going to be talking about in this course are in terms of communication, are signals that are being produced as a result of vibrating flaps of tissue in a vocal tract. How fast sound travels through the medium is essentially inversely proportional to how close the molecules of the medium are to each other. So you can see in the ground, right, those molecules are going to be packed really tight together. And this has resulted in a very fast speed of propagation of sound. So sound travels actually fastest through the ground, oddly enough, right? And this is how you can develop very precise images of objects buried underground using sonar. You play sound waves through the ground, it hits the object and bounces back to give you an echo, essentially very much like echolocation works. Water is sort of in the middle. Again, you have water molecules are connected to all other water molecules, but there may be other things that are suspended in the water that are interrupting that. So water molecules still being connected, that also results in a much faster speed of sound than the speed of sound in air, which is the slowest. And again, that was just, you're looking at how the gases in air, if those molecules are very close together or spread further apart, if they spread further apart, it's going to be a slower speed of transmission. If those molecules are packed really tightly together, then the speed of transmission of that compression wave will be faster. Okay, so just some anatomy of a sound wave kind of thing. Again, these are similar terms that we're going to be using with light when we talk about visual signals and information that's encoded in light waves. The wavelength is the distance between two peaks. It's also the same distance between two troughs of the wave. And then, of course, then the frequency then is the time it takes for one wavelength to pass a set point. So we will say, okay, I have 10 wavelengths passing this point in 1 second. Each of those is we refer to a wavelength as a cycle. So that is cycles per second. That would be 10 cycles per second, which is a very low frequency sound or low pitch sound. We measure this in hertz, which is technically cycles per second. We just abbreviate that Hz, named after the scientist that first defined it and discovered it. So high frequency sounds, you have a lot of wavelengths passing. a particular point in a 1 second. Low frequency sound, there are very few wavelengths passing that point in a particular point in time. Also, we refer to high frequency sound as high energy sound. Of course, you have, again, a lot of wavelengths. You have a lot of compression and vibration of molecules that have inherent energy in them that are passing that point at any given in 1 second, for example. The amplitude then is the height of the wave as we look in a transverse wave. This of course is when you have the point where you have all the molecules bunched together the most and they're vibrating. So basically the amount of energy that they have in those vibrations, the intensity of that bunching together we perceive that as loudness. And so we measure that in decibels or dB. Decibels are a logarithmic scale, so 1 + 1 does not equal 2, weirdly enough. Roughly, it's approximately 6 dB per doubling of loudness or halving of loudness. So if I take away 6 dB, that sound is then half as loud as the original. If I add 6 dB, it's now twice as loud as the original. We often actually perceive it though as 10 dB because our per doubling of loudness, because our sound perception is not as good as some other organisms. Vocalizations that have multiple frequency components, a lot of frequencies contained within them, are referred to as broadband signals. Band refers to the range of frequencies. So these tend to be, in general, more sort of aggressive vocalizations, but they can also include things like echolocation clicks, and in this case, here on the left-hand side of the screen, bottlenose dolphin squawks, which kind of sound like echolocation a little bit. It's kind of an kind of noise. There's my interpretation of that. Whereas narrowband signals cover a small range of frequencies. There's very few frequencies involved in those. Those can be flat and more tonal, like a flat whistle, like you might use in a sports event, or the bridge that we were hearing in the video where Bernice was being trained, so the very flat tonal whistle. These are bottlenose dolphin contact calls, which are simple upsweep, and so it's just like a noise. Now you can see there's lots of variation though, right? So you overall have the same shape and narrow range of frequency components, but some of them, contain more frequencies than others. Some are more narrow than others, and of course the shape over time is referred to as the signal's contour, the shape of the vocalization as it changes over time. So how are vocalizations produced? Mainly this involves movement of air past vibrating flaps of tissue within the vocal tract. So in mammals, for example, our main vocalization apparatus is going to be our vocal cords in our larynx. So here's the trachea, right? This main tube that goes down to your lungs. The vocal cords are here in the middle. So essentially, when you exhale and you have air moving past your vocal cords, that sets up vibrations in the vocal cords, right? Which are then transmitted to the air in your vocal passageway, right, within your trachea. And then those air molecules, again, are vibrating, they're bumping into each other, and they're setting up those compression waves that then travel out past the epiglottis and out into your mouth and past your teeth and your tongue and your soft palate and out your mouth, typically. This is true of mammals, mainly how most mammals produce vocalizations. We're going to talk later on about vocal production in toothed whales, because they are mainly producing vocalizations by vibrating flaps of tissue that are just behind their nasal passage. and their nasal passage has migrated to the top of their head, which is the blowhole, right? The larynx, of course, is used also by amphibians. And then birds, most birds use, actually, well, I should say all birds have a syrinx. In most birds, they have two. Some birds just have one. Their syrinx would just be below where ours is. So, right, so ours is sitting here squarely in the middle of our pharynx, right? The trachea is down here. The syrinx in birds is sitting below that, and it's literally in the branches of the trachea that are going to go down to the lungs. So because you have two lungs, right, you have two vocal apparatus here in a bird. And this basically enables them to produce sound differently on one side than on the other side, right? Which helps explain some of the complexity of birdsong that we see, where you have two different frequencies being produced at the same time. And the question for a long time was like, well, how are they doing that? And then, of course, someone dissected a bird and said, well, guess what? They have two vocal apparatus where we only have one. And so this allows them to produce those sounds independently. For my money, doesn't this picture look like a penguin with a Santa hat, right, and little boots? And yeah, I know, once you see it, it's like you can't unsee it, really. So vocalizations are generally made up of multiple frequencies. Even narrowband vocalizations are often composed of multiple frequency components. It's just fewer than in broadband vocalizations. The lowest component is known as the fundamental frequency. So this is typically the frequency that is set up, the vibration that's set up by the original vocal apparatus before it gets modified as that sound travels out through your mouth and your nose out into the environment. Those modifications along the way often produce harmonics. So the sound that you're setting up, that original vibration, some parts of your vocal apparatus are going to absorb some resonant frequencies from that, and some are going to amplify those resonant frequencies. And resonant frequencies are those that are produced at multiples of the fundamental. It's essentially a standing wave that's produced as a result of that vocalization and amplification by the vocal apparatus. Harmonics can be, again, not all vocalizations contain harmonics, but those that do, quite often there is additional information contained in those harmonics. Quite often location information, but it can be other identifying information about the caller. In some species, it seems to be subspecies identification data or social group information is contained in those harmonics. So how is sound received? For most animals, noise, which is of course unwanted sound, as well as signals and cues that are traveling through the air or through water or even through the ground, are received through vibrations in a membrane. So you have, and this is a model here of a human ear, but any other mammalian ear is going to look fairly similar. You have vibrations, again, in the air or the water are impacting the tympanic membrane, which we write as our eardrum. Those vibrations are then transferred to the bones in our middle ear. Not all species have all of these bones. Some don't have any bones. But eventually those vibrations make their way to, again, in the case of birds and mammals, a fluid-filled space that has a lot of hairs in it. And the hairs are attached to a part of another membrane that is connected to neurons. And so when the hairs are vibrated, and are vibrated in response to specific sound frequencies. So when those hairs are vibrated, the vibrations are transmitted to and essentially set off or trigger the neurons, and then the neurons are firing information that then is collected by different parts, particular part of your brain, or your auditory cortex, and that's processing all the sound information together. So we can see on this visual here of, again, the human ear, the sections of the membrane that are picking up high frequency or high pitch sound, this is high energy sound, are closest to the membrane, which kind of makes sense because the wavelengths for high frequency sound are going to be very short, whereas the wavelengths for lower frequency sound are going to be longer. And so they have to travel farther to stimulate the parts of the membrane that respond to, again, those low frequency sound, which is on the opposite end of our fluid-filled space. Sound decreases in intensity or amplitude as it travels away from the source. And of course, this is because, of course, those molecules of the medium, whether it's air or water or the ground, are vibrating and they're bumping into each other as the wave passes through the medium. So as they're bumping into each other, right, some of that energy is transferred to the next particle or the next molecule, but some of that energy is lost as a result of the impact of the molecules together. And that loss of energy, again, results in sound decreasing in amplitude or intensity as it travels away from the source. Sound gets quieter as it goes away from the source, right? Which makes sense, right? So sounds that are further away are going to be, quieter than sounds that are close up. And that's what we refer to just as attenuation or spherical spread. There's another source of attenuation, which is frequency-specific attenuation. This essentially refers to the fact that high frequency, right, or high-pitched sounds have more energy than lower-pitched sounds because of the number of wavelengths that are passing a point at a particular period of time. There's a lot more energy, you have more to lose, and so you lose it more quickly. So high frequencies attenuate more quickly compared to low frequencies, and this means that high frequency sounds don't travel as far as low frequency sounds. So high frequency sounds are generally not used for long distance communication because they just don't travel very far. There's another problem with high frequency versus low frequency sound that is a direct result of the difference in wavelength. So high frequency sounds, again, have a very short or small wavelength. As sound waves encounter objects, if the object is larger than the wavelength of the sound wave will bounce off the object and be scattered all over the place or bent or refracted or possibly return to the sender as an echo. If the wavelength is larger than the object that it's encountering, the sound wave will generally, some of it might bounce off, but generally it's going to go around that object because the wavelength is larger than the size of the object. So this helps explain why a lot of species use low frequency sounds for long distance communication. They travel further because they don't attenuate as quickly, and they're much less likely to be distorted by encountering objects in the environment because most likely they're going to go around the object rather than bouncing off and being distorted. It also helps explain why high frequency sounds, sometimes very high frequency sounds, are used to gather information about the environment because those very high frequencies have very short wavelengths and they're going to bounce off objects in the environment and come back to the sender as an echo. So this is, of course, why bats are using very high sound. It's so high we can't even hear it. We have to slow it down to be able to hear bat echolocation. And the same generally goes for echolocation in our toothed marine mammals as well. They're using very high frequencies to get information about objects in their environment. So the idea here is that signals are, and this is true of visual signals and olfactory signals as well, they are shaped by selection for effective transmission through the organism's environment, right, based on the environmental conditions that they typically live in, right? So if I live in some place that's hot and humid, that air is going to be full of, water molecules. That's actually going to absorb a lot of sound. sound doesn't travel as far as it does when the air is dry, for example. So you're going to get differences in how the signal is actually shaped and its properties to make it travel efficiently from the sender to the receiver, because again, a signal has been shaped by selection to change the receiver's behavior in a way that benefits the sender, and you can't do that if the sender does not get, if the receiver does not get the message. And just like signals are shaped for effective transmission, species perceptual systems are also precisely tuned to the frequencies or signal properties or cues that are relevant to them in terms of how they make a living. So for example, owls tend to be sensitive to lower frequency sounds that are produced by their prey as the prey wanders through, right, the forest floor. Those rustling leaves, those tend to be lower frequency sounds. But the owls also are likely going to be sensitive to extremely high frequency sounds. Vocalizations may be produced by their prey. And so again, they're tuned into how can I find food? Well, I'm either eavesdropping on their conversation, which requires that I be sensitive to a particular range of frequencies, or I'm listening for those very quiet, low frequency sounds that they otherwise might be trying to actually hide or keep from me. Those sounds are likely to be very soft or very quiet, and it might be really hard to hear those if I have other noises that are overlapping. So species are likely to be sensitive to frequencies of sounds that are used for communication, but also sounds that are relevant for them in terms of predator detection or prey detection. What is noise exactly? Noise is basically any sound that's unwanted or unwelcome. It's sort of like a weed in that way. So noise for one species might be the signals of another species. It's something that is extraneous. It's not relevant to them. It may actually be getting in the way of communication. Typically, again, signals are adapted or shaped by selection to function in the environment for effective transmission, and this often means transmitting through a medium and going around noise sources that are typically present, like the sound of rushing water, or wind, or insect noises, or other kinds of sounds that are typically present in the animal's environment. Those are what's referred to as the ambient or historical noise profile for an environment. So for example, with my sage grouse, that's typically an environment where you have some wind, you have some insect noises, but especially in the morning, it is often like pin drop, painfully quiet. There's really no other ambient noises around, which means that the vocalizations of the sage grouse don't have a lot of other things to go around to get from the sender to the receiver. It's just the effects of the temperature. Again, cold air tends to allow sound to transmit further than warm air, and so those sounds travel quite a good distance, even though they're sort of mid frequency. They go pretty far. So what happens when we add additional noise that's typically from human-generated technology into an environment? What happens? Well, that often what happens depends on the properties of the noise itself, how loud it is, so the amplitude, how often the noise is present. Is it something that is sporadic, or is it something that is constant? It's there all the time. And what frequencies are contained in the noise. Quite often, as we saw in the previous slide, right, animals are adapted to trying to detect noises and sounds that are relevant to them in terms of their ecology, right? They're listening sometimes for quiet noises, or they're listening for signals that are coming from social group members, or the snap of a twig or something like that. They're listening for stuff like that. So if the noise is at a frequency that is the same as the sound that they're listening for, right, they're typically going to be very sensitive to those frequencies, right? Polar bears, for example, are very sensitive to high frequencies as well as low frequencies. Mid frequencies, not so much. You know, stuff that's more what we're used to is not as relevant for them, right? So how a species reacts to the presence of noise really depends not only on the noise properties, but also on their particular ecology and what they find disruptive or aversive or painful. If they don't like it, either because, hey, this thing is freaking me out, I think it might be a predator, I'm freaked out, I'm out of here, or, hey, this loud noise is actually physically painful, I'm going to try and get away from it, right? This makes good logical sense. I'm going to leave the area. And by doing so, right, I might be leaving a foraging opportunity. I might be leaving a mating opportunity. I might be putting myself in danger for predators and things like that that I had been trying to avoid by being where I was. And now to get away from this noise that I really don't like, I am now in danger of, you know, of dying. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown both terrestrial animals and aquatic animals that noise is aversive, and it almost doesn't matter the amplitude or the frequency that's used. Animals will avoid that noise source, diving away from it, moving away, altering their migration route to avoid the noise. And of course, this is going to have consequences for them in terms of impacts to their individual health and fitness. Another effect of noise on animals is, of course, interference with communication, also interference with their detection of cues. Like we were talking about in class, right? Cues are quite often byproducts of organisms just living their lives, things that are really hard to hide, but they tend to be very subtle, right? It's not going to be a very, very loud sound, right? Or some sort of, you know, big, bright, flashing light usually. That would be a signal, right? Cues tend to be more subtle than that, right? So if you are let's just say a female sage grouse and you're sitting on your nest and you are listening really intently for any noises that sound like an approaching predator, right? You hear a predator coming or you smell them, you know, whatever. But in this case, we're talking about sound. That would be a very, very bad time for you to get up off your nest and go get some food, right? Because you're leaving your nest unprotected. And of course, the female is very nicely camouflaged. If she basically sits tight on her nest, it's far less likely that a predator is going to get and eat her eggs or her chicks than if she gets up and leaves. Well, if we have any kind of noises in that environment that are making it hard for her to hear those subtle noises, such as the background hum of a generator that's, you know, maybe several hundred yards away, but it's loud enough that that noise from the generator is overwhelming or rendering undetectable the noise that she's listening for, that obviously would be a big problem, right? The female might leave her nest at an inappropriate time because she can't detect the signal or the presence of the predator, right? As I talked about on the first day, right? And we think that background noises are masking or interfering with the detection of the male advertisement signals, right? The whistles and the pops that they are using to attract the females to their presence, right? The females are listening for, hey, where are the males this year? You know, they move around. Where are they this year? And if the females can't hear the males, then they can't find them in the landscape. And of course, this may result in lost mating opportunities, right? Or increased predation risk, things like that. So the masking of cues and signals that are used for important, you know, fulfillment of important, you know, life problems like, you know, finding food and finding a mate and not getting eaten by creatures. All of those things, if noise is interfering with those, the animal can even stay in the area, but again, possibly the noise is not loud enough It's not painful, it's not aversive, it just might be a little annoying, but it still can be impacting the animal in a negative way and negatively impacting their fitness, really. And so that's something we really have to consider, is not just, is the noise painful enough or disruptive enough that the animal reacts in a way to avoid the noise, but even if they stay in the area, they may be experiencing interference with communication as a result of masking. And what's unfortunate, and this is true of the sage grouse as well as a lot of marine mammal examples, the frequencies that are produced by a lot of our technology noise sources, right? Underwater drilling rigs, energy development, boats, cruise liners, all that kind of stuff. Most of that is happening in frequencies that are used for communication by a lot of marine mammals, and therefore they're going to be sensitive to those frequency ranges. So not only might they find that noise aversive at lower levels, but it might be really getting in the way of their communication. Okay, so the question is, can animals compensate for masking? And essentially that's saying, can they get around it somehow? Can they respond to noise interference in a way that maintains communication? And the answer is, well, maybe. It's going to depend on the situation and on the species. Again, just reiterating, signals have been shaped by natural selection over evolutionary time periods for effective transmission within a particular environment. So a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the last maybe 15 to 20 years, or a little bit longer than that, to the acoustic environment for, in particular, our marine mammals, for example, these are very new sources of noise. And again, your sound production system and your perceptual system, your communication system have been under selection for a long period of time. So animals may or may not have the flexibility in their communication system to be able to alter their vocalizations in such a way that they maintain communication while not losing information or changing the meaning of the message that they're sending, right? And also they have to have plasticity in that regard, and they also need to have plasticity or flexibility in their vocal tract to be able to alter their vocalizations, which again, they may or may not have that. So there are some sort of stereotypical ways that you can respond to interference from noise. And some of these actually humans use in different situations. So for example, if you are walking into a crowded area, not so much post-pandemic, but I'm sure you can imagine, a club or someplace where there's a lot of people milling around, everybody's talking, right? It's loud. You're trying to hear the person that you're talking to, who's maybe a few feet away from you, but you might be having trouble hearing them because there's so much background noise. So to compensate, generally, we increase the amplitude of our vocalizations. It's known as the cocktail party effect. You talk more loudly in a crowded room because you're trying to get your signal from point A to point B without interference from this masking background noise. Increasing the repetition of your signals, calling more often, is another way of dealing with this. That's something that air traffic controllers use all the time. The information that they are imparting is so critical to get to their audience, which the pilot, that they repeat that over and over and over again until they get a response. Okay, yes, you heard me. Hey, did you hear this? Yes, I heard you. Hey, did I hear you? Nothing. Okay, I'm going to repeat it again and repeat it again. So again, the animals may call more often as well. Again, with the idea that if I'm sending those signals more often, hopefully some of them will get through to my receiver, right? I might change my signaling to take advantage of any gaps in the noise. If the noise is predictable and it's on and it's off and it's on and it's off, right? If I can, I might wait for that quiet period and then send my signal, right, in between the noise. And so there have been a lot of different studies of, in particular, how marine mammals respond to introducing noise to their environment. And it seems to vary, right? And so increasing the duration of the calls, again, sort of talking more slowly, sort of drawing it out, again, with the idea there of any gaps in the noise. Maybe some of my signal will get through. And again, maybe increasing the rate of calling and so on to try and take advantage of that. But all of that requires some flexibility in the signaling system and the communication system so that your receiver still understands the information that they're getting. It's not like, what was that? It's a garbled mess. I don't understand what you were saying because you changed the signal so much. And again, it requires some plasticity in their vocal tract as well. The high speed of sound in water means that any noises, anthropogenic or otherwise, are going to travel farther than they would in air. This also means you're living in the medium. It's hard to avoid those noises. In fact, whalers used to actually play underwater pulses at about 3,000 hertz, 3 kilohertz, right in the prime range of marine mammal communication, especially whale communication. So that's a range that they're very sensitive to, and they would play these very loud sounds in order to basically help them spot the whales, because the whales would leap out of the water to try and get away from the noise. They found the noise so aversive and painful that they were just trying to get away from it. And that was involving leaping out of the water just so that they wouldn't have to be subjected to this noise source. So like I was mentioning earlier, addition of noise, the most common response is just to leave the area. Well, sometimes you can't really, right? Because of whatever it is that you're engaging in, or the nature of the noise. It may just be, I don't have time to get away from this. It may be something I can't get away from. And so, yeah, I'm annoyed by it. Or it might be, I find this new stimulus possibly painful. Long-term exposure can result in loss of hearing. This also something you find aversive is stressful. Again, if you're repeatedly exposed to that, or if it is something that it's in your environment and you actually can't really get away from it, that is going to be chronically stressful. And we all know the negative effects of chronic stress on humans. It's the same for cetaceans. So things that affect your immune system, things that affect your blood pressure, and it's just really not healthy long-term situation for them to be in. So again, this is going to be extremely stressful. We know chronic noise exposure can result in hearing loss, either temporarily or permanently if it's bad enough. Temporary hearing loss, we know from the underwater exposure experiments that we did with Bernice at Long Marine Lab. She would display what's referred to as a temporary threshold shift. Essentially, that's the ringing in your ears, in response to being exposed to noise, right? After like a rock concert or something like that, you have trouble hearing, and you may or may not have the ringing, but you just have trouble hearing certain sounds or certain ranges of sounds, and it goes away over time. But again, you can imagine if this is repeated, if you're repeatedly stressing their hearing system, that this could result in permanent damage. Or again, if the sound is at a frequency that you're especially sensitive to and loud enough, this is something, again, a very high amplitude noise may actually cause cavitation bubbles to build up in tissue, resulting in rupturing of that tissue by essentially almost like a sonic boom underwater. And that's something that's going to cause tissue damage and has been implicated in many deaths of cetaceans that have been exposed to this loud sounds being played underwater as far as these mid-frequency sonar experiments. So again, that exposure to loud sounds, again traveling very quickly through the water, again can cause gas bubbles to form in the inner ear of cetaceans, and that can cause tissue trauma, hemorrhages, and remember, their ear canals are right next to their brain. So as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about hearing. We have in our ears, we have bones that are transferring the sound from that vibrating membrane to that inner container that's filled with fluid and the vibrating hairs. Most cetaceans are actually receiving sound through their jawbone, and it's being transmitted up into their inner ear. They've lost those bones. The hammer, anvil, stapes are gone, and it's just kind of a gelatinous filled area where they're receiving the sound, and it almost goes directly into their brain. So any trauma in that area is likely going to cause trauma to their brain right there. And so that's really the danger here in terms of being implicated in deaths. And again, even low frequency sonar arrays have produced stranding events in response. So again, animals are just either confused by that or just trying to get away from the sound, and they beach themselves. And sometimes they can get back to the water and sometimes they can't. So these different kinds of sonar testing that have been done by the Navy, again, low frequency sonar, and now the big thing is mid frequency sonar. It's been a big thing up until very recently. I want to say the last 3 or 4 years, I haven't heard anything about them proposing any new kinds of testing. And I'm hoping that that is in response to a lot of public pressure as well as data from these studies and from different kinds of scientists that have been testifying at hearings as to the damage that's being caused by these sonar tests, and just trying to demonstrate the fact that maybe they're really not necessary, and this is maybe not something that that we should be doing.